Hey everybody, hello and welcome to ngHouston. We're pretty excited tonight because we have Mike and Brandon coming on to talk about NgRx. This is something that everybody's been looking forward to for a while. So I want to introduce the panel first. Alex, you want to say hello?
Hi, Alex Miller. I'm a solution architect at Sloan Consulting. Do a lot of work across a lot of different stacks. So everything from still AngularJS on any kind of stack to getting to work with Angular in .NET, Node backends, all kinds of good stuff.
Awesome. Glad you're here, Alex. Denny, you're up next. You want to say hi?
Yeah, hi everybody. Glad to be here tonight. I work for Servient as a UI developer, predominantly in AngularJS right now. I'm going to be helping them this fall actually transition their code base to Angular 2. So I've been learning about that, and I'm learning how to migrate through that. Pretty new to NgRx and just observable, so I'm really interested to hear tonight how to kind of approach learning the topic and seeing what it's all about. So glad to be here. Thanks a lot, guys, Brandon and Mike, for being here tonight.
Awesome. Thanks, Denny. And we have Paul Spears. Paul, you want to say hello?
Hello, I'm Paul Spears with Oasis Digital. I'm a lead tech here, working on Angular, Node backends, Java backends, also lead curriculum author for Angular Bootcamp.
Thanks, Paul. Keith?
Hey. Yeah, I'm Keith Stewart. I'm a UI tech lead at CollabNet, working mostly on UIs for systems in the DevOps realm, but I also dabble quite a bit in a number of other libraries in the Angular world. And I've got a couple of systems that are running NgRx these days, so excited to talk to these guys today.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. Reggie, squeaking in under the wire. Just barely made it, man. I was worried about you. I didn't think you were going to show up in time. You want to say hello?
Yep, made it by the skin of my teeth.
There you go.
But yes, my name is Reggie Davis. I work for Poetic Systems. I'm support dev. Definitely work a little bit more on the DevOps side now, but I definitely like playing with Angular in my free time. So
there you go. I'm glad you could join us by the skin of your teeth.
By the skin of my teeth.
You guys know me. I'm Bonnie, and I run ngHouston, and we're here every week, almost every week. And Mike and Brandon, man, everybody's been pretty excited. I've gotten so much feedback on you guys in this session, and people have been marking their calendars for a while. And I think almost every single person that I asked if they wanted to be on the panel, everybody was like, yeah. So we're looking forward to this. So I'm gonna point it over to you, and you guys can take it away.
Yeah, I'm Brandon Roberts. I work at Synapse Wireless. I'm a senior software engineer.
And I'm Mike Ryan. I'm also a senior software engineer at Synapse Wireless, and we're an industrial Internet of Things company. And Brandon and I work on building these high-performance reactive apps using Angular and NgRx to visualize large sets of industrial IoT data and controlling these systems. In our free time, we're also core contributors to NgRx. And I'm excited today to talk about first, well, what is NgRx? But then we're also really excited to talk about what we're going to be working on next. So if I can get this turned over real quick, we'll jump right in. Okay, so NgRx is the reactive extensions for Angular. And this is a community project. It was started by Rob Wormald, and it's since grown to be Rob, Victor Savkin of Narwhal, Brandon, and myself. And we build small reactive libraries for Angular. And don't let small deceive you. Even though they're small in size or small in API, we think they're really powerful and can really change the way you build Angular apps. You can view all the projects on our GitHub organization at github.com/ngrx.
So the main library in NgRx is Store. And Store is an RxJS powered state management system for Angular based on the Redux pattern.
What you can do is it's this shared service, and you can use it to share state across component trees and share state with services. And we do that by unifying all the events in an application as these things called actions. And once you've modeled all the events as your actions, then computing state from those actions is done with reducer functions. We'll talk about what these reducer functions are in a bit. When you're using NgRx, you visualize your application sort of like this.
So you have actions, and those actions are events that you want to model for things that happen in your application, whether this be UI events or responses from network requests or other things of that nature. And you also have reducers, which take in actions and take your state or your initial state of your application, compose a new state, and that state is flowed into your components. And this cycle happens over and over out throughout the life cycle of your application.
Hey guys.
Yeah.
I don't think we see your slides.
Oh no, we've gone so far. We'll get that fixed.
I see them on the Hangouts, but not on YouTube.
Okay. Let's see if we can fix that. How's that? See him?
I think we're good. We saw them for a second on YouTube and then they went away. And but YouTube's about 30 seconds behind us, so we gotta see.
Okay.
Yep. There you go. We're good.
Great. So this is the visualization of what the NgRx flow looks like in an application. And like I said, it really comes down to these actions. And an action is a simple, plain JavaScript object. It only needs a type of string, and these types need to be unique across your application. So for instance, when a user logs in, the action that represents this event might be called auth login success. And these actions get passed to reducer functions.
So these reducer functions take, like we mentioned, take the current state of your application, which is modeled through an interface, and take that action, and that action flows through the reducer and changes the state if it needs to, or it passes the same state that was returned to it. And this gets returned, like I said, as a new state or the current state, depending on what the action is. Because you'll have many reducers over the lifetime. Many actions will hit many reducers, but they will not all be processed by all reducers. So reducers only handle certain actions.
And so I know that can be a lot to take in, but we like to think of this as a database. So you're not going to write just one large reducer for your entire application. Instead, you're going to write reducers that handle certain slices of state. And these slices of state, we like to think of them as tables in that database. So you might have a reducer that manages all the books in your state container, or one that handles the authentication status. NgRx does some magic in the background, and it takes all these individual reducers and takes all the state that they're returning and wraps them up into a unified state object. Now this state object is what's actually delivered to your components with an observable service. It also loops back in and goes back to your previous reducer. So like Brandon mentioned, every reducer gets the previous state and the next action. And using the action in the previous state, that's what it allows it to compute the next state.
So with Store, we provide you with this global service called Store, which is the main service that you'll be using to dispatch actions and to get pieces of state. Now Store flows over time because you will always be dispatching actions and returning new state, and you will use this service throughout in order to set up your components for your components to interact with each other.
And if we continue with this database model, one of the most important parts of the store is the ability to select state. Since state is delivered to components as this single large object, components need to be able to query the store for the state that it cares about. And it does that with the select method, which allows it to query for some specific part of state and then get an observable of when that piece of state changes. Before we moved on to the next part of the library, was there any questions about store?
I have.
Sure.
That select you're talking about, where you're selecting a slice of the overall state, is that like a subscription that you would put in place for one particular part of your app, and then that would receive that stream of observables to react to just those changes in that part of the app?
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the question is that, do you use select to get notifications for just one part of the state? And the answer to that question is yes. So if our state tree contained, are you authenticated, in addition to other state like my list of books or some other transient state that we want to share across components, you could select that part of state, am I authenticated, and that observable we get back will be of just that piece of state, and it will only update when that specific piece of state changes.
Okay.
This is handy for binding to templates in your components, because you can use the Angular's async pipe to deliver these state updates to your template, and Angular can intelligently and performantly update your templates when your piece of state changes.
Okay, great. So different parts of the application would have a different select statement when they initialize those parts of the app.
Yep.
Right, and those using the select function, those selectors are also reusable. So you don't necessarily have to create a new selector everywhere you want to use it. You can compose selectors together for common pieces of state and like derive a new piece of state that may exist in a few places, but the overall principle is still the same.
Great, thanks.
Now, one part of this that we haven't talked about is, how does state really get changed? Because we've said that components can dispatch actions. But when you're building these kinds of apps, it's sort of weird, where do I make things like HTTP requests or handle WebSocket messages? And that's where the next sort of pillar of the NgRx ecosystem comes in with NgRx effects. And NgRx effects is a companion to NgRx store, and it gives you a channel to handle these types of side effects in your Angular app.
So if we look at side effects, normally these are things that interact with the outside world. You could think of these as HTTP requests, WebSocket messages, offline storage, or any like time-based events that may happen that you don't want to necessarily happen in your component. That way that we talked about before, your components without side effects are easier to test, because your components ultimately are you want them to be responsible for selecting state and dispatching actions. So that way they don't have a lot of responsibility.
So we looked at this model before of what does an NgRx app look like. So your components are dispatching actions. These are modeling user events. They're maybe interacting with a form or navigating around your application. And reducers are still handling these actions and delivering state updates to components. But what's sort of neat about this NgRx model is, because you've modeled all your events using this action interface, you now have this stream of all the events that happen in your application. And what NgRx effects does is it says, okay, well, let me treat that action stream as an observable of all the events that occur in my app. And then effects can listen for specific actions. Maybe the user submitted a create comment action by interacting with a form. A side effect could then take that action, make the appropriate API call using the HTTP service, and then when the HTTP request finishes, it can map that into a new action. And that new action then goes back in your reducer. Reducers update state, and new state is delivered to components. And this creates the reactive loop in an NgRx application, where your side effects are cleanly isolated from your components. Components don't have much internal state of their own, and reducer functions, which are pure, can be easily tested. And that's sort of the goal of NgRx, make everything really easy to test.
Can you touch on what a pure function is? We've got listeners that are at all levels. Can you talk about what makes a function pure and how that adds to the testability?
Absolutely. So we said a side effect is anything that maybe talks to the outside world via an HTTP request or time or WebSocket messages. And a pure function isn't going to be doing that necessarily. They're going to be receiving input, and for any given input, as in any arguments you pass that function, it's always going to return the same result. And it's going to do that by not changing any of the things that are passed into that function, and it's not going to rely on any state of the outside world. So you can really think of these as almost mathematical functions, where maybe if you have an add function that takes two numbers and it always returns the same result, which are those two numbers added together. And what makes these so valuable in your application is if they always behave consistently for any arguments, then writing a test to assert that it's behaving consistently becomes more straightforward than if that function relied on some outside state. Does that answer your question?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
So once you have this reactive model, there's also the service to actually interact with this action stream.
And this action stream provides an observable of every action that flows through your application. And all these actions are things that you want to key off of, like we mentioned, for side effects, things that your component has said, I want to do something, and this provides that interface to do that. Now, just like reducers, you only handle some actions within certain reducers, and this stream of actions gives you the ability to do that also for performing side effects using the of type operator, which filters on a certain type of the action and provides you an observable of that continuing up for only things that you want to perform side effects with.
So if we take that example that I talked about where your user has interacted with a form to add a comment to a post, maybe a side effect uses this of type method to listen for all the times a user submits this form. And then using observable operators like merge map and switch map, it can make these HTTP requests, map the results back to actions, which are then delivered to your reducers. And so what do these actually look like? Well, they're just plain Angular services. So you write a service, you inject this action stream, and then you create these sources of actions. And these sources use the actions service most of the time, though they can also be using streams of WebSocket messages. And they deliver new actions back. And the way NgRx effects works is it looks for, on all your services, this effect decorator. And when you have a property that is an observable of actions decorated with the effect decorator, it'll subscribe to that observable for you and will deliver those results back to NgRx.
And this is also a common model of event sourcing. You produce some actions from components, and then in turn, the effects can also produce actions that may come from many different sources. So it provides you another way to perform tasks and then trigger new actions that may update your state or like redirect the user somewhere else or it's things of that nature.
So we've talked a lot about testability. And before I get on to these dev tools, I want to make a comment about these tools. And we know that they sound sort of abstract and high level, but these are really tools to reach some goal. So you'd use these indirect storing effects and you're trying to build real-time, high-performance applications where you really care about testability. And that leads us to our dev tools. And our dev tools are one of the most powerful consequences of building your application this way. When I say consequence, because if you think of your application using NgRx, if we're modeling every event as an action, every action creates a new state. And you can order these actions based on time. So when a new action comes in, you get a new state. You can visualize this as a series. And what the stored dev tools allow you to do is they allow you to inspect all the actions that are being dispatched in your application, along with the state that's being derived when an action is dispatched. It's a really powerful tool for getting introspection into how your application is behaving. But beyond that, since we can order these based on time, you can also use the powerful time travel debugger to visualize what your application looks like for any kind of state that your application may have entered. And so if you've ever been in a situation where maybe you're trying to debug a loading state in your application, or you're racing the request to finish, the time travel debugger will let you pause in a loading state and work on that state itself. And this results in really big productivity booms for developers. And this all works by integrating with the Redux DevTools extension. As Brandon mentioned, NgRx is an Angular and reactive implementation of Redux. And these DevTools were created in the Redux community. We've worked with the Redux DevTools extension developers to integrate cleanly with NgRx so that you don't have to worry about setting this up yourself.
When I first I installed that Redux DevTool thing, the first time I started looking at NgRx, and it was so cool. It's very easy.
We highly recommend you maintain an example app in your NgRx organization. And if you want to learn how these kinds of apps work, our recommendation to you is to download the Redux DevTools extension, open up that example app, turn on the DevTools, and just visualize and see how these actions are actually changing state. It's a really powerful learning tool in addition to being a development tool.
So another library in NgRx is Router Store. And Router Store provides a connection between the Angular router and store.
Hey, Brandon, before you guys start on that slide, there's a question on the chat.
Sure.
For the people watching online. Jay wants to know, how do we share the state between feature modules?
Jay is looking into the future.
Okay, just hold on, Jay. Okay, so you're gonna get to that in a minute?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
All right, good question, Jay.
One of the questions, probably the most frequently asked questions, and one thing that we did focus on. So yep, we're gonna get to that one. So Router Store. Router Store helps you maintain your router state with storing effects. Now it does this by synchronizing the URL with the store. So as you navigate through your application, the Router Store takes the current URL, reduces your state with that URL, and allows you to keep it in sync. Now this comes in handy with the DevTools, but it also provides custom actions for navigation so that you can, from side effects, you could do things such as navigate to another page or change the state of your application without changing the URL using show, or if you want to change query parameters or just navigate back and forward. These are custom actions that you can use for navigation that you would normally use within effects. And as I mentioned a minute ago, this works with DevTools. So as we've talked about being able to rewind your state, you can also use this to rewind the URL as your state changes. And this will cause your application to navigate to that previous URL as well as change the state when you change that state using DevTools. So that way you can get a complete picture, even from your browser URL point of view, of what your state looks like at that given point in time.
So I got a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I'm trying to understand exactly the flow there on that last bullet point, the URL changes in state triggers navigation. So so I have a component or a service, and it dispatches an action to NgRx store, and I have a reducer there to act on that. So are you saying I can put any kind of custom logic I want in my reducer to then modify the URL and the state, and then NgRx store will then router store will then navigate on my behalf based on that arbitrary logic and arbitrary calculation we authored?
Yes, if you write a reducer function that will change router store provides a reducer that you can compose to change that state. So yes, you can trigger navigation by changing the state of that router reducer, which has like a path property that it keeps in sync. So if it detects that the state changes and you went from login to sign up to log into the sign up page, and you trigger that through an effect or through a reducer function, then it will pick that state change up and navigate you there, so that you always stay in sync with whatever the current value of their state is for the router.
Cool, thanks.
So
awesome.
Does that mean if you're using router store that all of the navigation that you do in your application needs to go through the router store, or if you did navigation otherwise, it would still pick that up?
Yeah, you can continue to use the router's APIs normally. You can keep using router link and injecting the snapshot services to interact with the router state. This just gives you an additional way to interact with that router state in a way that's more consistent with the NgRx way. So when you're using router store, you typically end up doing a mixture of both. In your components, you keep using things like router link, but in your effects, you might be dispatching custom actions to modify that URL.
Got it, thanks.
So I know we just went through a ton of libraries really quickly, and I wish we had more time to go into depth on how to use these. But if you want to learn how to actually integrate these reactive tools into your library, we highly recommend a workshop that we gave at this past NgConf called From Inactive to Reactive, where we take an application that's using more imperative code styles and introduce these NgRx libraries to turn it into a reactive application. What we really want to talk about today, for I think the first time in a large public setting, is ngRx 4. And so,
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
This goes to the question of how do you maintain state and features. And that's one of our goals, but really we took a step back from all these libraries and really thought about, okay, how can we take these reactive tools and make them better? So one of our main goals was to keep the API small and simple. If you've noticed through the talk so far, that we've only mentioned somewhere maybe 3 or 5 actual APIs that you have to remember in order to do things like dispatch actions, select state, or perform side effects, or even listen for actions. And that has been a goal that we wanted to keep with this new version. Even though we've added new features, there's still not a lot that you have to remember in order to use these libraries as a whole. Another goal is to support the way developers are actually using NgRx. And this is something that can almost be a little bit difficult to admit as library authors, but sometimes you build a tool with some intent and users take it another direction. And so NgRx 4 is trying to realign some of these APIs to support the way developers are actually using these tools. And we think that's going to provide overall a much better developer experience. Right. And as we mentioned before, we want this new version we feel will provide that better developer experience for people who maybe have an existing app and haven't used NgRx before, as well as those experienced users who have used version 2 and 3 of the libraries, but will give them more powerful tools going forward and make it easier to integrate this new version as they upgrade the app forward. So the 2 NgRx libraries we're talking about today in terms of the big changes is store and effects. And first, store. So in the current version of store today, you write your reducers up front, you declare them at the beginning of your application, and then it's very opaque as to how you can actually change them from that point forward. And so this caused developers a lot of grief when they wanted to start lazy loading reducers and adding new state to the store when you enter new parts of the application. So our number one goal for Store with NgRx 4 is to support loading feature state lazily. We're also taking advantage of a lot of the new features in TypeScript 2.3 and 2.4, specifically mapped types and string enumerators, to support stronger type checking throughout your application. We are big believers in TypeScript, and we really gain a lot of power from the tool when we can verify the correctness of state changes using the type system alone. We're also baking in a better way to query state into NgRx Store. We've seen a lot of users use third-party libraries to write selectors, and we want to maybe provide better APIs to do that right in the library.
So if you remember, if you've used NgRx before, one of the major updates that we did was, in order to use NgRx with AOT, you would have to use a function to return your map of reducers, and it became kind of cumbersome because it didn't feel natural. It wasn't very ergonomic. So we've changed that in the new version to like a simpler module, which also a simpler method that also follows the Angular guidelines for ng modules using .4 root. And this will take, you can just provide it with a map of your reducers now, and those reducers in the root of your application will be combined together without having to do anything special in support for AOT compilation, which was something that many developers came across and we thought we could make easier as a result.
And so if you haven't seen NgRx Store before, let me break down what's happening here. As I mentioned earlier, you model your application sort of like a database. So here I'm declaring that in the root of my application, I care about sharing two pieces of state, some layout state and some authentication state. And so I create this object using layout and auth, and I provide a reducer function that handles the layout state and an auth reducer function that handles the auth state. What this does is when I inject Store, I'm going to get an interface that sort of looks like this. I'm going to have a large single state object that has my layout and auth state as derived by their respective reducers.
So also, like we mentioned, the biggest thing was being able to compose your state through feature modules. And that's where Store module feature comes in. And in this case, you see we have a blog and we have an object of posts, which has our post reducer and comments. And this will, using this module will let you dynamically add pieces of state to your existing state and to add more reducers to compose these pieces of state.
So in this case, we're registering a feature called blog. And we're saying, if you're using the blog feature, the shared state in this feature is the state of all the posts for the blog and all the comments attached to those posts. And I've written a reducer that manages those pieces of state respectively. And now when this is lazily loaded in, my state object looks like this. I still have my layout and auth state that I declared in the root of my application, but now blog is inserted dynamically, and along with it comes posts and comments state managed by their reducers. And so in this way, you can compose multiple features all together without having to worry too much about naming collisions or about the uniqueness of different state. We also mentioned that we wanted to make selecting state a whole lot better. So if you are trying to query at some feature state, for instance, the blog state, you really don't want your components to have to worry about, okay, where is the blog state actually coming from? Where is it in the selector tree? And so we've written two new APIs called create feature selector and a normal create selector. Create feature selector will automatically write a selector function for you that will select that piece of feature state. And you pass this into store.select to select that state. Create selector allows you to compose these selectors and to create new functions for querying state. So for instance, if I want to get to the posts nested in blog, I can use create selector, providing in select blog state, and I can nest in and query smaller parts of the state. And again, I'd pass this select post state function to store.select.
And you'd also, these APIs are, they also are memoized. So these selectors aren't reselecting state every time unless one of the parameters of the selectors change. That way you're not making it, they're very efficient in selecting state as well as when using them with the select operator and selecting pieces of state.
So beyond store, we've also tried to simplify the API for effects. We also wanted to give developers more control over when effects are actually running and when to stop them. We're also trying to address some of the pitfalls that developers have encountered when they're using NgRx effects.
So if you're familiar with NgRx effects and how you register effects, it used to be that you would use the effects module and you would have a .run method, and you would provide a single effect class to register, and you'd have to do this, I don't know, a countless number of times depending on how many different effect classes you had. So we simplified that API to where now it's just an effects module for root, and you can provide a list of effect classes and they will get registered in the exact same way with a lot less boilerplate.
Similarly, we're offering the same lazy loading mechanism to use with the store by giving you a for feature method. In a feature module, you can declare all the effects that run with that feature module. And when it's lazily loaded, your effects start when the module is loaded. And while we're talking about feature effects, we also noticed that developers were wanting to share these feature effects across, well, multiple other features. Maybe you have a shared set of components that you share across many features, and they have their own effects. So we've made it so that you can list an effect across many different modules, but only run once. And that's a common pitfall that we've aimed to solve with this new API in NgRx Flex 4.
So the effects from the previous version, the effects still look the same, but we've given you more control over the life cycle of these effects. So if you look at these particular effects called user effects, you may only want these to run within a certain boundary. And we've provided a new API that will give you an easy way to control that life cycle.
So this lifecycle is called NgRx on-run effects, and it provides you a declarative way to describe to NgRx effects when an effect class should be running and when it should be stopped. We do that by merging all the effects on a service, providing it to the method that implements this interface, and the method can tell us when should be running and stopped. So if you look at that user effects example, and we only want this to run when a user logs in, and we want to stop them when they log out, we can implement NgRx on-run effects to do that.
Hey, Ryan.
Yes.
Or sorry, we have another question in the chat. Justin wanted to know, does order matter still with the effects in store in the imports array? I think he's talking about right there at the top. Do they need to be in a certain order?
They do not.
All right.
There was a lot of confusion in NgRx 2 about when do effects start running? Do effects run before state is triggered? When do actions come through the application? And that's something that we've also tried to address. So now all your effects run at the same time, and they always run after reducers have had a chance to handle the actions.
He was saying, he's asking about in ng module, it doesn't matter?
It does not matter.
That's awesome.
Yep, just use it as you want to, and hopefully we're doing standard defaults with NgRx 4.
So you were planning for us to try to break it?
Oh, please break it.
I like your style.
Yeah.
So while we're asking questions, I got another one about the new feature states. So I think I saw this question also in the chat of how do we actually like run reducers across the feature states themselves?
So
for example, if we've got two different feature states, feature stores that we've lazy loaded, and I need to reduce a top level property that actually requires those two pieces of state and needs to combine them together to produce a top level state. Like, how do you author that reducer, and where would you author that?
Sure. So when it comes to actually deriving new state from what exists in the store, so let's say we've got two separate features loaded in, you'll actually use selectors to handle that derivation of state. And so what you do is you declare both of these features or import these feature modules into your combined feature that you're working on, and then you use a selector to query into both of those features' states to deliver a result that computes maybe something shared or something unique that you need those two values from. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
So another really big problem with effects is when users start using them, there's just so many ways where you can shoot yourself in the foot with NgRx effects. And we've taken a look at what some of these common errors are and have tried to introduce better error detection so users get errors and helpful feedback faster. So let's assume I've got some blog effects, and there's an effect called get posts. And it's a relatively simple effect. I'm using the action service we talked about and the of type operator to listen for an enter action to occur. And when an enter action is dispatched, I'm going to merge map into an HTTP call. And I'm going to get all the posts. But there's a bug.
Right. So if you follow the model up to this point, we know that all actions that flow through our reducers must return from side effects must return a new action. And here we're retrieving the post once you enter the blog, but we're not returning those posts as a new action. So normally, if you were familiar with this in the previous version of NgRx, it would error and say maybe you haven't provided a type, or the error would be pretty
opaque.
It
would be consistent for an Angular error message, but that's not quite what we're aiming for with NgRx 4. We want to go above and beyond and really give you meaningful error messages. So now, if you write an effect like this and forget to map the result to new action, you'll get an error that looks like this. It says, hey, this specific effect dispatched an invalid action. Here's the source. Here's what it dispatched, and here's where you can go to fix this problem. Another common source of errors is, well, let's say we've gone in and we've fixed this effect. And now we're going to map that response into a new action. And we go on and we're very happy. But there's a problem.
So once again, if you're looking at this effect, we're getting posts, we're mapping them to a new action, but we haven't handled any errors. And in a perfect world, we don't have errors. Posts always come through. We always return a new set of posts. But what happens if the server's down or the API request failed? Your effect blows up and you don't know why, but we took that into consideration in helping developers use these tools to debug those problems also.
Right. If you wrote an effect like this in NgRx Effects 2 today, you don't even get an error message. It just silently fails, and this effect stops working, and it's very mysterious what happened. But now, if you write an effect like this, you get this kind of error. And it says, hey, this specific effect threw an error. Here's the error. Here's a very clean stack trace you can follow to find where that error took place. And it hopefully gives you enough metadata to solve this problem instead of failing silently like it does today.
Hey guys.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
That's beautiful.
I mean, we are you guys, but that's nice.
Our goal really is to help developers with NgRx 4. And most of the new features that we're showing today, you could do them with NgRx 2. We think that, or hope rather, that we're building to developer expectations more and that we're helping them build apps successfully. And so doing error messages with this level of detail has been a big priority with NgRx 4. And we want you to break it. So even though it's not officially released on NPM yet, we have begun introducing nightly builds. So if you go to github.com/ngrx/platform, you will find detailed instructions on how you can use the new storing effects in your application today. The APIs are stable. We're just looking for you to break them. We want to hear about problems or difficulties in your application. We know that we've got some work to do when it comes to improving the testability or testing APIs, and that's what we're currently working on. Once we have those finished up, we plan on releasing NgRx to NPM. We've been historically bad about predicting a release date. We said June 1st, and then it came and went. We said July 1st, and now I believe it's July 6th. So rather, we will finish it when we feel like developers can be as productive as possible with this release, and hopefully that is sometime this summer. And that's what we want to talk about. So we'd love to answer any questions.
Oops, sorry, I was muted and I was talking. What do you think, panel? You guys got questions for these guys? Are you guys all muted?
In the move from NgRx to NgRx 4, are there any breaking changes that we need to be worried about as we move forward onto some of those newer features?
There are breaking changes in so much that there was weird behavior with NgRx 2 that we've made unweird. If you've had to work around that weird behavior, you'll have to remove those workarounds. And we have pretty comprehensive documentation of those already. There's a list of breaking changes you can find in NgRx platform docs that details, okay, what has changed. But for the most part, you build the apps the same way and they function the same way.
As you mentioned, there's a complete migration guide in the platform repo that shows you that. And we also have docs of what the APIs look like today with explanations that you can go back and reference. And those docs are an evolving thing. So if you see any issues there, please point them out, and we'll be sure to improve those also, because that's part of the developer experience too.
Awesome.
Hey guys, Jay is in the chat and wanted to know again about sharing state. Can you guys maybe go back over that one more time?
Sure. So with NgRx 4, we're giving you 2 new ways to register reducers. There's going to be a new store module.4 root, where you can declare, these are all the reducers that I want to handle in the root of my application. You'll also have a new store module.4 feature. And this is where you can say, I have a feature, and when this feature is lazily loaded, register all of its reducers for me. And so if you want to share state across features, you're going to write a feature module that has all these feature reducers. And the first one to dynamically import it, and in the application, those reducers will be registered for you, and you can access its state just like any other piece of state in the store, I should say.
And so if you want examples of some of this code, I mean, you guys have a really good README on your GitHub repo. So do you think that would be the best place if you guys have docs somewhere else, or you should go to the GitHub? Because like when you go into the GitHub, on the main page, there's not a whole lot. But if you go into NgRx store, NgRx effects, NgRx router store, then you're going to see a lot more documentation and examples of actually what this code looks like.
Yes, there's documentation under each one of the modules in the platform repo that gives you a high-level overview of how to install the libraries, how to basic usage of them, and then towards the bottom of each README, There is links to API, how the API looks, common usage, and also just further explanation on those APIs. And we also have the example app, which will come into the platform repo soon. That is a collection of best practices when using NgRx. And a lot of people have gotten a lot of value out of that. And it's one of those things that we update, you know, as we have worked on NgRx, and we'll have an update in the works to show how these new features work within the example app also. So we do have that coming down the pipeline.
That's
Yes.
awesome.
Definitely start with the product readiness, explore the example app. We have a very active community on Gitter. So if you go to gitter.im/ngRx/store, there's always somebody in there answering questions. And those are definitely two of the most useful resources for getting started with NgRx.
Gitter.im/ngRx/store.
Yep. Yeah. And of course, if you, like I said, we want you to find issues. If you see something that doesn't work like you think it should, or something that we could make easier, you know, file an issue, or if you're the type to put in a pull request, we'll look at those too. So it's a community project, and we want the community to continue to contribute to it.
I'm tweeting these links so that people can find you and find that Gitter is like, there's people on there right now. That's pretty awesome.
Yes, it's a very active community.
You can pretty much go in there at any time of day, and someone will be in there to try to help you.
That's awesome.
I've got a question. Does NgRx integrate very well with other state stores? For instance, one in particular that I've been interested in integrating with is with the Apollo clients for working with GraphQL.
Yes. So we have talked, especially to Yuri, who is a member of the Apollo team. And one of the big motivators for this store module.4 feature is to better support third-party libraries. So we know developers are excited about it because they want to dynamically import reducers. But one of the cool parts of that API is that means third-party developers can register their own reducers, and they'll just be added to the store for you. So we're really excited to get this released and then help the Apollo Angular team integrate with NgRx using this new 4-feature API. So it's definitely on our roadmap, and we're really excited to get support or better support for it.
Awesome.
Hey guys, I went and got that Gitter, and I was tweeting it, and I was busy, and I turned away from the YouTube chat for a minute, and then I went back, and it's crazy. Do you guys have the YouTube chat open, or you want me to read these questions to you? Because there's a bunch of them in there.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Read them off.
I looked away for a second, and I came back, and I was like, whoa, wait. Okay, Sandeep wants to know, what kind of data should I really use NgRx store for? For example, if all I needed is to get a username from the server, and that is not going to change, should I still use store? Which is actually a really good question, because there's a lot of beginners that, I know NgRx, I mean, I love NgRx, but when you first hear about it, it's kind of an abstract thing, and it takes a minute, I think, for people to wrap their heads around it. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, so identifying what state to put in the store is one of those things that I wish we could like write hard rules for, and have this like easy decision chart. But it's kind of fuzzy sometimes. The best rule of thumb for us is if more than one component needs access to that username, and those components can't share it via inputs, then yes, put it in the store. That way, each of those components can inject the store and get the username. But if it's not, if all that you're trying to do is share a username across your components and it's not changing frequently, and your application is that small scoped, we'd also say that maybe NgRx isn't quite right for your application. We don't prescribe it as the solution for all Angular applications. We prescribe it for apps that have this problem frequently.
So like if you have an input form, you might not necessarily want every single input field on your store, right? Because that might be overkill. But it seems like, especially like maybe anything that's going from one page to another. And that was the thing that I always used to have a hard time with, was sharing data from different views and different components that might not necessarily be right next to each other. But also, anytime you're going outside of your own app and going and getting, you know, data from somewhere else, or especially if you have like different users, like if you're sending chat messages across different logged in users, you think that would be the case?
Yeah, definitely. That is something we pretty much work on a daily basis. Is our app is it's a real-time multi-user app that receives data from live sources like a WebSocket. So using something like using NgRx is something that's tailored, you know, fits very well with that model. Or data, if you have data that, like I said, comes in from lots of sources, or it also gives you like a standard API to use to model your app with. Because you know, as you start building your apps are naturally going to grow and grow and grow, and to be able to get a clear picture of your app at any given point in time, I think is very valuable. So determining whether NgRx works for your app is still something that you'll have to decide, but we recommend it if your app is somewhat complex and needs is constantly updating and those type of things, then it's definitely a model you should look at.
Awesome. Okay, so we have more questions in the chat, and I just actually posted them in the Hangout chat. So if you got, can you guys open up that sidebar and see that? We have a couple more questions from JPat, and then one from Shorty.
Sure. So the first question is, shared state has to be in a feature module, correct? And that's partially true. All of the all the reducers you declared in for root are also shared. So for feature isn't saying that's the only place where shared state belongs. It's just one way to get dynamic state inserted into the store. The next question is, for example, let's say I have the state property called title in root module. How can I get that state in a feature module?
Right. So we've talked about selector composition, and if you have state that's in your root and state that's in a feature module, you would have a common place that you would select those pieces of state from both places, or that you select that piece of state from those places and combine it together. Since your selectors, your state is all going to be funneled from your root, the root of your application, every one of your selectors eventually flows up to the top. So you would have to decide where, it's definitely possible to do, but you have to decide where you're going to put those selectors to be able to select those pieces, those different pieces of state. If that makes sense.
The next question comes from Justin, and he asks about how to actually track errors from effects. So in our example with the get posts call, how you would solve that is you would add a catch statement to the API request. And it can be a little fuzzy what you do from there. And what you do is, an error is a new type of event. And you want to model this error event using its own custom action. So maybe we would have written a get posts failed action. And when the effect fails, we would dispatch a get posts failed action to the store. And then, yeah, I would think in your store container, you would have some piece of error state that's shared across components. When that action is dispatched, the error is captured in your store container until some user process clears it.
Yeah, I'll say a very common example of that is maybe like a login page. You submit your credentials and you perform a side effect that says go attempt to log me in. Your authentication comes back and says you failed, your login failed, but you need to display a message of why it failed. And you would have a piece of state that captures that error message, and your action that comes back from your effect would change that state to say that your authentication failed, and then you could in turn select that piece of state to display to the user. Now, alternatively, if it passed, then in your reducer, your action would tell the state that it's clear and that it should not display that error anymore. So that's just a simple example of how you could use that in the situation of a form where you need to capture that error or clear that error, depending on the situation. So can we use nightly builds in our production apps? I can't tell you not to. Proceed with caution, because I would be amiss if I told you, yeah, sure, go ahead, use it today. But I would tell you to try using the nightly builds locally with your application first, and see how it works out. But if you're the type to wait for the official 4.0 stamp, we hope to get that out soon. So try it now. If you want to try to see how it integrates with your app. Yeah.
We'd be very curious to know what your results are.
Yeah, I told Jay in the chat, I generally would not run nightly builds in production unless you're one of those overachievers that wants to be the first one to open up a GitHub issue, which then, go ahead. Jay has another question. We need to pull Jay into a panel one of these days. He's got some good questions. I have a scenario where I want to loop an array of IDs, call a web API, and get more data for that ID. What? I'm going to copy that into the chat, guys. I have a scenario where I want to loop an array of IDs, call a web API, and get more data for that ID. Where can I run the loop? Oh, loop the actions.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. This is something we have to do in our applications from time to time. And the scenario is let's say I have a list of post IDs, and I want to get each individual post. And so for every post ID, I need to make another API request to go get it. And that can result in as many API requests as there are items in this array. And that loop is performing that in a side effect is the perfect place to do it. The trick is that it's sort of, okay, what is the combination of RxJS operators that's going to allow me to perform the side effect? And that's the fun of reactive programming, is getting to learn the operators and figuring out how to cast those spells. But there are a number of resources we recommend to learn about those operators, including Brian Troncone, who's one of the community members who contributes to our documentation. He maintains a really excellent list of each operator and how you might solve this problem, but definitely doing a side effect.
So what he's saying, so what Jay's saying is he wants to run a loop of, go through a collection of items and then perform, go get some more information about each one. And actions are, that's not exactly, so its effect is exactly for what he's talking about, right? And then action would basically be whatever triggers it, or, go call another effect. There's an action and an effect is basically the method that you're going to run each one through.
Right.
And the action, I think, would be basically the name, like, of what it's doing, like get user details or something like that. And then also get user details success or get user details error would be actions beyond that.
Yeah, you would dispatch once you finished getting all the user details.
I got this.
Yeah.
All right, panel, you guys got any more questions, comments?
Yeah, I've got a question. For those who are new to NgRx and haven't used it before, do you have any thoughts on how they might recognize a good opportunity where NgRx could really solve maybe a problem that they're running into just using traditional Angular approaches? Yes.
The one sort of the impetus, going back into the beginning of this project and the roots of it, is Redux, and really this type of pattern was designed to solve race conditions. So sort of the classic example of that is at Facebook, they had this bug where they have a notifier in the UI that tells you the number of unread messages you have. And the user opens up the menu, reads one of the messages, and that should decrement the counter. But they also have to update that with the REST call. And in that time, maybe more messages come in, and you get yourself into this race condition where, okay, now I don't know what the state of this counter is supposed to be. I've had so many things that could change it. It's hard to track down what order they came into, and maybe this number is no longer true. And so Redux and NgRx is a reaction to that problem. Because you're modeling all of your state changes as actions, you can stamp out that race condition by ordering the actions that change that in a timely way. So if you're encountering race conditions in your application because of state being updated that quickly or interactions from users, definitely take a look into NgRx. It could be a really simple way to solve those types of race conditions.
Great, thank you.
So unless someone else has some questions, I've got a whole list here. I've been taking notes. So if anyone else has a question, jump in and stop me here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to start by commenting, I love the new state definition you guys are putting in there, defining that, just putting that object in the module import directly, not needing to use that compose reducers call anymore. That's really going to ease a lot of pain for people just learning NgRx from scratch. But I kind of have some questions about maybe some things that are to come or things that might be hiding inside version 4 here. I don't know. So I know a large part of why we use NgRx is also just to better utilize immutable programming, right? Programming practices. And so we usually bring along a store freeze module to go with that. Any thoughts on maybe adding that as like a flag whenever you're trying to provide that or import that module at that time to say, hey, actually, just go ahead and like lock down and put a freeze on those objects and give me a warning if something mutates it.
Yep, you've touched on something that's hidden in NgRx 4.
Ooh.
So, yeah.
You unlocked the secret level, Paul.
In NgRx 2, you used to not be able to just give an object of all your reducers. You'd have to create this unified reducer function by hand using this function called combine reducers. And it would take that same kind of object and produce the reducer function. Well, then we point our users to these other libraries that provided what were called meta reducers. And what a meta reducer does is it can interact with the way state gets updated sort of in a layer above your reducer functions. And a really common one is this module called store freeze. And so what store freeze would do is it would freeze the state object before it got passed to your reducer function. If your reducer function tried to do a mutation rather than deriving a new state, you'd get an error about it. In NgRx 4, there's a new API called, and this is why we haven't talked about it yet because it's got a bad name. But I believe we call it like a reducer factory functions. And a reducer factory function is a function that takes a dictionary of reducers and creates that unified reducer for you. And so our idea for this API is that there might now be something like a store freeze module that you just list in your imports like any old regular Angular module. And it, behind the scenes, can register one of these types of reducer factory functions. And the store freeze mechanism sort of comes with importing an ng module versus this really confusing compose API. So yeah, we want to improve it. We already have the API. It's hidden away in NgRx 4. We need a better name, and we need to solve some small ergonomic issues around it. But that will definitely be locked down before we release version 4 for efficiency.
Awesome. So that actually leads right into another question here. So I noticed that you mentioned that the new feature-based stores allow for third-party library authors to say, hey, I have a reducer set here that you can then run, and I can maintain my own little state piggybacked onto the greater application state. Does that hint to possibly new NgRx modules that are going to utilize that new API?
Is the potential for it is definitely there to do that. That was why we built that module, so that if you, like you said, if you have a third party that provides its own set of reducers and you want to use that, you can. We had looked at modeling that actually in router store because it provides its own reducer to be able to add that piece of state to your existing state, add those reducers to your existing state. And that model seems to work pretty well. So that, like I said, if you have a third-party library that it may provide its own state, it provide its own selectors, those APIs are there to be able to build that up. So definitely so.
So yeah, and the hint at future problems, because obviously we're building that API just as much as for ourselves. We mentioned that we're working, or we want to work with the Apollo team to get better integration using this 4 feature. But I would say after NgRx 4, the NgRx team members are very interested in offline applications.
In what?
Offline applications.
There you go.
Applications that want to be online but have become offline. And how do you handle an application that goes into that state? I'd say that would be our next big focus after we get this out the door.
I have a question.
Okay.
I've been playing a lot with serverless applications recently, and I would like to know if I was interested in implementing NgRx, would that have to live on the client side, or would there be a way for me to put it on the serverless side, if you will?
Good question, Reggie.
Yeah, NgRx is a client-side solution, but this model has a more formal name beyond NgRx Redux. It's the first half of modeling all these events as actions is event sourcing, and then dispatching these actions to create state changes and querying against it has a more formal name called command and query pattern. And you could easily take these types of concepts and apply them in the back end. I'm sure there are a number of libraries that do this today, but NgRx does not work on the server and beyond building like a server-side rendered app.
So if you're doing serverless Angular, then you can definitely do NgRx.
Right, but it's going to run on the client or and in the front-end application.
Nice, cool.
All right, I think we're Paul. Do you have more questions on your list?
I do. I'll keep going if you want.
Well, unless does anybody else? Going once? Going twice? All right, go, Paul.
All right. So the create feature selector feature there. I noticed that the parameter that you passed to that was a string.
Mm-hmm.
When you pass it a string parameter, is that a type safe operation there in terms of it'll actually understand the type of the piece of state you get back, or is there an equivalent call that will give you back a typed version?
Yes, that create feature selector, it wasn't shown in the slide, but that function is a typed, function so that you can provide it with an interface of what that state looks like, or what your state looks like when even though you're using a string selector. So that is there as a typed function.
Yes, we tried to, we haven't removed magic strings, but we've tried to make them as type safe as possible with NgRx 4.
So I think that's Rob's doing, right? He really loves those strings. Is that?
He does love them, but there's a problem with them, and that's the Angular team is really interested in using the closure compiler, which does property renaming. And so these string selectors often break in an application that's using the closure compiler. So we think we might have converted Rob and others like him to using functions more often than strings, but we still have support for them, and they're better than ever with stronger type safety.
All right, one more and I'll leave you guys alone. So any thoughts on any possible future improvements to the API around defining your list of actions in your action generators? So right now, these larger apps, we define, I've seen several different kinds of companies and clients use different kinds of models for like how they want to list out their actions, and they all are wild and varying and messy to maintain. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So this is something that's sort of out of our control, depending on how type safe you want to make it. Instead, we're trying to work with the teams that build these tools to make this a little bit easier. And in TypeScript 2.4, we got one new feature that I think is going to go a really long way towards reducing boilerplate. That's doing string enums. Previously, you had to declare your action types as constants and then do a type union between all these constants, and it worked. It was type safe, but it was a lot of boilerplate. We think string enums are going to go a long way towards reducing it. And then another way we're curious in solving this is in the next version of the Angular CLI, there is this new piece of the toolkit called schematics. And this will be available as part of this official Angular SDK that they announced at ngConf. What schematics will allow third-party developers like the NgRx team to do is to write their own custom code generators. So the Angular CLI today, you can use the Angular CLI to generate components and modules, and we are very curious as to how we can work with the team in this new schematics API to let you scaffold out actions and reducers and effects for common use cases like CRUD operations.
Awesome, good stuff. Yeah, I'll be looking forward to those generators. That'll be nice.
Yes, I said too.
All right, I think I'm done bugging you. Thanks, that was some really good stuff. Good work, guys.
That was awesome. Alex, Denny, Keith, Reggie, anybody else? Nope. Okay, we're good. Guys, this was awesome. You guys are really cool, really nice guys, very approachable. I think that some people, I mean, just from talking to people, I think some people are still a little bit intimidated by NgRx because it's, it's new and they're still trying to figure it out. How would you guys feel about coming back in a couple months and talking to us again?
Well, come on.
I mean, I would have you guys on like every other week, but I know you guys actually have code to write and jobs and stuff. But I would love to have you guys circle back around in a couple months because I think some people are just kind of starting to dive into it and figure it out. And then after they've gone out and played with it a little bit, they probably will have more questions. But I think this is awesome. And you said something about you have a demo project that you're going to put up, but you don't have it up yet on the GitHub?
Oh, we already have it up. It's called the ngRx/example app. You can go visit today, but right now it's using the version 2 APIs that exist as published on NPM. We're working on an ngRx example app update that brings it up to ngRx 4. Right. There's already a pull request out, so it's already complete. You can go look at it. We just need to work out some small bugs, but if you want to see the API changes in action, there's a pull request you can go reference.
Okay, so, and Jay had a good question too. If they have more questions later, where would they go? And I told him to go to the Gitter, right? So yes. I tweeted a link to your to the Gitter page that you guys have, which is a really great resource because I love stuff like that, Gitter and Slack channels, because you can go on there like anytime. And I mean, you have to roll the dice. There's no guarantee there's going to be somebody at 2 o'clock in the morning, but hey, there might actually be somebody there at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, I have yet to go in the Gitter channel and there not be somebody there to help you. Even if they may not be there instantly, they're, within a small amount of time, I think that channel, somebody in that channel will try to help you out.
Yeah, and you can open the Gitter channel and ask a question and then just kind of leave it open and go about your business, and it'll ping up later and be like, hey, someone answered you. So also, can you guys tweet out a link to the demo, Mike, that you just talked? I always want to call you Ryan, and I want to call Brandon Ryan too. I've been telling people about this. I'm like, we're gonna have Mike and Ryan on that. No, Mike and Brandon. Yeah. Anyway, can you tweet a link to that demo, because I know there's a lot of people, like I said, that I've talked to that are just starting to get into NgRx. So I think there's a lot of need for beginner, like where do we start? And this is pretty exciting. This is awesome.
Yeah, we will definitely tweet that out. And if you're looking for help beyond the Gitter, you can of course reach out to Brandon and I on Twitter. I'm at Mike Ryan Dev.
And I'm at Brandon T. Roberts.
And then I also want to use this opportunity to plug a couple of companies that have been really helpful for us for NgRx. So if you're looking for help even bigger, like you're looking for workshops or training materials, there have been 3 in particular that have been a big help in terms of giving us a lot of feedback as we've been working on NgRx 4. And that's the Angular Bootcamp guys, which we have one here on the panel with us. And Narwhal, Victor Savkin, as mentioned, he's on the Angular, or he was a previous Angular core team member, now he's an NgRx team member and runs Narwhal. Big help, and then ThoughtRam. So if you need help beyond just what you can get in Gitter or Twitter, definitely reach out to any of those 3 guys or companies. I'm sure they'll be glad to help you out.
They are super nice. Yeah, actually, I was Samantha saw a picture of Rob on Twitter earlier today, and she saw he was growing out his beard, and she figured he was going to go work at Narwhal once his beard gets long enough. So But yeah, I think that's those are all awesome, super cool people. So feel free to tweet out links to whatever you want to. We'll retweet you, and I think it would be awesome if you guys would come back and talk to us again soon.
We'll do.
One last question.
Okay.
Who do y'all have winning the 2018 NBA finals?
I'm gonna go with the easy answer and say Golden State Warriors win it again. It's not gonna be as easy as last year, but they're gonna win it again.
Okay.
I'm gonna go with the Nuggets.
We got the Denver guy over here. He's gonna go for them. He regardless of what their team was like. So.
Man, I hope they make the playoffs just for that.
I know Keith is fixing to come off of mute, you guys.
He's ready to jump on.
No, Sacramento Kings, they're going to win.
Oh, here we go. Sacramento Kings.
You got him started, Reggie. Now we're going to run long. Okay, speaking of running long, I wanted to mention next week, I'm actually super excited, and I know, Keith, you're going to be excited too, because Keith and I are working on a project together, and we're actually using reactive forms. So I sweet-talked Schwarty, and Schwarty's, I don't know if he's still on the chat, but he was in the chat a little while ago. So I sweet-talked Schwarty into coming and doing a reactive forms session for us. And I know he has a lynda.com course, and Deborah Carrata has an awesome Pluralsight course on reactive forms. Anyway, so we were supposed to have Minko last week, and we had a scheduling switch. So now we're going to have Schwarty come and talk to us next week about reactive forms. The week after that, we're going to be in person at Improving in Houston, and we have Reggie, who is going to be talking about serverless Angular, which will go very nicely with NgRx. We have some really cool topics coming up, and we've got some awesome stuff. We got Jeff Welpley coming to talk about Angular Universal. We got Mike Ryan and Hans Larson coming to talk about the CLI. Sonny is going to be here in a couple weeks talking about Ionics. We got some really cool stuff. And as soon as we get done with all of them, we'll circle back around to Mike and Brandon.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. This was really cool. This was a lot of fun. I know everybody was looking forward to this, and I think you guys definitely lived up to all of the anticipation. This was cool. NgRx is cool. You guys are cool. The panel, you guys were awesome. And I think that's about it for tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.